So our speaker this morning is Professor John Gallacher from Oxford. He's Professor of Cognitive Health and Director of Dementius Platform UK, which is an MRC-funded public-private partnership that focuses on accelerating research into the early detection and treatment of dementia. He's an expert on brain health and the use of big data in medical research. He holds a visiting professorship at Imperial College London and an honorary professorship at the University of Hong Kong. He's the principal investigator for the Caerphilly Perspective Study and a member of the UK Biobank Steering Group, leading on cognitive and psychological assessment. It's a pleasure, John, for you to welcome you this morning. Thank you for coming to us. And John is going to speak to us on observation, superstition, and mysticism in modern science. Over to John. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. Thank you all for tuning in. It's a great pleasure to have the privilege of addressing you. So, as I said, thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I'm going to talk about observation, superstition, and mysticism in modern science. Now, if you thought this was about classifying the impact of all the different philosophies that are around on modern science, I'm afraid I've completely misled you, and I'm delighted to have done so. That is an area, fascinating as it is, I think sometimes it doesn't take you much further in our understanding. But what I want to do is to understand how different components of thought are essential to the conduct of modern science. And my view is that if you look at these different components, then it gives you a deeper understanding so that you can form your own opinions more confidently. So just for a quick definition here, by modern science, I mean scientific activity, not just the corpus of knowledge. All right, the corpus of knowledge is ever changing, but it's changing because we are doing something systematically. And I might suggest, typically we're doing it rather well from a technical perspective. All right, so let's just let's consider what is the basic epistemological question that actually we will go around asking. And I think Schaeffer many years ago framed it quite well in his series, How Then Shall We Live? But actually it can be more precisely defined in how are we going to reduce the uncertainty we face in a complex and often hostile environment. And you can look at most human activity in this way. We don't know what's going to come around the corner. We're born into a challenging environment. It's often hostile. It's very complicated. And what we really want to do is to understand that. And what that means in many ways is reducing the uncertainty. I want to know what's going to happen next. I want to know why it's going to happen next. I want to know what I'm going to do when it happens next. And that is I find that a very useful way of organizing the information around me. To do that, my argument is that effectively we have what I would describe as an epistemological toolbox. And that involves three distinct ways of thinking. The first one is observation. Now, in one sense, this is obvious. I appreciate that. This is our experience, sensations, thoughts, emotions. If we're being slightly more precise about it, it's measurement. The observation can be about very complex phenomena. It can be about very simple phenomena. It really doesn't matter. It's, if you like, the touchstone of reality that we have access to. But having access to thousands and thousands of facts really doesn't affect, what can we do with that information? It is not very useful. What we then like to do is to bring them together into some sort of causal nexus. And human beings have been doing this for ever since they've been human beings, really. And what this allows you to do is to take one fact, one observation, link it to another observation. Now, the curious thing about this is there is actually no logical basis for this. And there is no empirical basis for this. The only thing that is of values that the extent to which it works or not. And so it is very much a superstition, but it's, in some ways, it can be a very useful superstition. Now, to make the point perhaps more clearly, over the years, there have been many different ways of, many different causal nexi that have been used. So astrology, magic, alchemy. But the wonder of, I think, and I do think it is wonderful, you know, I'm very impressed. The wonder of the mechanistic causal nexus is that it is predicted. And I think when you're looking at the ability of our various societies to rush through a vaccine for COVID, it's absolutely brilliant. You know, let's not decry it in any way, but let's understand its logical status. You know, it is something we assume in order because it works, and that's what we're about. So here we have a whole load of facts. We're organizing them in terms of causal relationships, but what do we do then? Well, actually, then we have to employ a value structure. And that value structure allows us to make decisions about what we will do under which circumstances. And the thing about the value structure is it's even more removed from the observation. It's also removed from the causal nexus. It stands alone by itself. And I don't think anybody disputes this. What is disputed frequently is what the value structure might be. But as it's outside of nature, it's outside of logic in many ways. It's something that we just understand. I call it mysticism. And I think that it's quite a legitimate way to understand the value structures. Now, when we think about what it might be, we know the ancient Greeks have come up with the good life, and I think our society is very, very aware of the environment of nature. The basic, if you like, intrinsic value that I come up with, that I see around me, in my colleagues, in our society, is what I might describe as the affirmation of life. Now, if you meet somebody who is does not appreciate the value of life, it's very hard to agree with them. And when you see policy decisions which do not affirm life, when you see activities which frankly destroy relationships, it's very, very hard to say, oh, that was a good act. On the other hand, if we're thinking about what we value, well, we like the diversity of nature. We like the complexity of relationships. We thrive on them, provided they are affirming us and we are affirming them. So we have this basic value, I would argue, of the affirmation of life. Now, in order to answer the question, however, we put these all together to come up with what we might describe as a picture of reality. And we are all doing it all the time in every situation, because this is how we think. We can do no other. The trouble with this is that the picture of reality is just that. It's just a picture. It's not reality itself. And the problem with reality is it's what you might describe as iconoclastic. You know, my picture is great, and then all of a sudden comes another fact, and my picture is inadequate. I might have this wonderful, wonderful system all set out, but then what happens? Something else comes along, and my great theory, my great model is destroyed by an ugly fact. And I find this happens frequently. In my analyses, I might be pursuing a hypothesis, and I'm really excited about it. Then I get hold of another data set. I check the hypothesis in the other data set, and yes, you've guessed it. Frankly, it's not supported. So we have this iconoclastic picture, but that's fine. That's fine. At least we have something to start with, something that we can simplify, something we can build up into complexity. And whether we're looking at a theological question, whether we're looking at a scientific question, because this is the basic question of life, we apply all of these tools to answer all of these questions. What surprises me, because I think this is a very integrated perspective. I've never met anybody who thinks in a different way, and I have tried. What surprises me is that basically our society comes up with two meta-narratives. There is one which says, okay, we live in a universe which is essentially a cosmological event. It's entropic, it's mechanistic, and it's competitive. It's Darwinian, it's competitive. And in one sense, the beauty of this account is that it is empirically predicted. And I think that is just, you know, well, I think that has an aesthetic all of its own, if I'm honest with you. I just enjoy that. On the other hand, it doesn't help us make any decisions whatsoever. And so the other view is that, well, actually, the universe is an ontological event because it's purposeful, it's personal, and it's relational. But my argument is that both of these views come from the same set of thinking process. And really, it is no real difference here. Actually, we want to understand basic questions of life, and we want to be able to predict what's going on. We want to be able to make decisions about what's going on. In order to make decisions, I need to have predictive value. But once I have predictive value, to organize that information, I need a value structure. And I've never met any exceptions to this whatsoever. Let's just move on to a question of what you might consider to be good science. So if we think of the initial singularity, and I think that my slides, oh, here they are, okay. And if we put the initial singularity at one end of a time scale, I hope you can see this lovely arrow moving across. From this point, we have, there we are. The aggregations of energy. So the universe happened, we call it the Big Bang, that's convenient, and the dust accumulates, etc., etc. And if you're a theoretical physicist out there, at this point, you should take over and give a really good description of what happens next. But then it dissipates. This wonderful aggregation of energy just dissipates into randomness. And I think that's very predictive. I think it's highly likely to be the case. And you'll just have to put up with this screen show as the order of this changes. But what happens next is really quite unusual. In fact, it may only ever have happened once. It may happen many thousands of times. That really is not relevant to the argument. And that is that for some reason, there is a place in this universe where life happens. And life is fundamentally different. It's not an energy distribution machine, an energy aggregation machine. It's an energy capture and recycling machine. And it's binding energy into a system. And that system is creating diversity and complexity over time. And there's something about this which produces us. And in this last sliver of time, you and I, who are personal, purposeful, and relational, have appeared. And it's very difficult for us to say, well, we're now going to engage in a neutral science. We're now going to engage in a science which has no intrinsic moral complications or moral necessity. I mean, my view is that all science is moral science because we are the scientists which do it. Our science should not be trivial. It should not be morally irresponsible. It should not be morally neutral. It should be morally positive. And what we're doing, what we are encouraging, what is satisfying to us as human beings, is doing science which, to try and capture it in a fairly broad, basic way, which is life affirming. I think the same model actually can be used to critique theology, just as the way it can be used to critique science. So let's just move ahead. Does science inform good theology? Well, let's just think of the concept of paradise lost or kingdom come. So here we are. You might call this the creation event rather than the initial singularity. It doesn't matter. And here we have time again. And here we have, if you like, the creation of a young man. Actually, man is probably the wrong the wrong term for this. Earthling. It's not a gender-specific term. So we have mankind, humankind, and then from humankind, they put in this lovely environments. The metaphor is a garden, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this. And then time passes, and there is the incarnation event. So we're obviously looking at a very strongly Christian picture here. And we have the cross. And I think you're all familiar with this. And following this, we have the resurrection. And at this point, I'm going to have to trust that we get the next. Wonderful. We have what you might describe as the second coming. Now, you have to forgive my cartoons. My artistic merits are limited in the extreme. And I actually gave up on the arrows. I just couldn't make them work at all. So we have second coming. And then if you follow your biblical timelines, now let me think. It's called the Great White Throne. Now you might have heard of this, but you know the theology is that God will come and hold this world accountable. And then once that's done, we have the new heaven and the new earth. Well, actually, that looks a bit like a fried egg, so perhaps we ought to get rid of that. But we have the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven. And as you all know, the New Jerusalem is cuboid. So that's a fairly accurate description. Okay. Now, I think this is, of course, I nearly forgot, of course. Something goes wrong. And I would have thought that you would agree that this is a fairly accurate biblical picture. I think we can argue the subtle details over certain points, and that would be seriously a very interesting discussion. I would enjoy that very much. Nevertheless, most of us would accept this. The trouble for me is that there's been a constant discussion about what happened and what went wrong in this garden. And I'm just going to use this as an illustration of something I hope won't be too controversial at all, but I hope will make a point. And there is a view that's still fairly widely held that there was this thing called a cosmic fall, and that in the garden something happened which affected the whole of nature. But my problem is, of course, I see no evidence for this. If you think this is good theology, it would show some sort of predictive value in terms of the historic, geological, and the biological record. And we just don't see any shift, any evidence for a shift in let alone in the order of nature at a physical level or whatsoever. But I'd like to suggest to you that there is a richer way of looking at this, and that if we looked more closely, we could start with the Trinity. And with the Trinity, we have this lovely synergistic relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit. It's relational at the very beginning, and this sets the tone for the whole of the rest of the scriptural narrative. And again, if we looked closely, we would discover that actually the Spirit hovered over the deep. And a richer alternative picture is that there is this creation project where there is order constantly being put into the system, resulting at, when we get to the very end in Revelation, of this lovely phrase, and there was no more sea. And if you think about it, and there are sort of, there's a whole load of scriptures which just point out that from the beginning of this creation project, there's been an increase in complexity, an increase in order, but there has been resistance to this order. And there is, if you like, there is an ongoing process of changing chaos into cosmos. And this is a beautiful picture, an absolutely beautiful picture. So we have a picture of a creation, of a creator God who begins with relationship. That relationship is embodied, expressed in life, in a physical, in our physical, biological life. And the morals come from that we are personally of value, that we have important relationship, we have a role and a purpose in life. And I'm not sure, and I have thought about this, but I can't find any other philosophy, any other way of looking at the world, which is as rich and as satisfying and as fulfilling as this one. This brings color to the cosmological event. This brings purpose to our scientific activity. This is why we are here, in order to discover the complexity and the wonder of this creation project. And from this basis, if you have a good understanding of the creation project and a good predictive ability from your understanding of the way the world is made, that means we can answer some basic questions more thoughtfully. So here's a basic question. What does it mean to be a human being? What is a person? What is their value? This little baby here has very little conscious awareness. I would suggest negligible reasoning ability at this point in time. But I would also like to think that everybody, without exception, at watching this, sees the intrinsic value of this individual and does not resent or regret in any way spending money on the health service, on the care, on the encouragement, on the social support that raising this individual requires. It is just fundamental to who we are. Perhaps there's another basic question. What kind of society do I want to live in? I think the COVID thing has really stopped the rampant capitalism in its tracks. And it really has displayed the importance of looking after society as a whole. It's been fantastic to go out and clap the NHS. But honestly, I'm just clapping the other people as well. I think they are fantastic. There's such lovely potential in all of these people in my street. So are we going to value each other for who we are, not for what we're capable of? Are we going to invest in each other because that's just the lovely thing to do? And then there's a third question. What does the future hold? Well, frankly, for this young child, the future wasn't very long. The future didn't hold a lot of hope. But for this child's mother, this was a precious moment. She decided to love this baby. And for the short time they had together, it was probably one of the most wonderful moments of her life. Tragic, but wonderful. So we need meanings which allow us to cope with adversity. And those meanings don't come from cosmological events. Those meanings come from understanding who you are, what value you have, where you're going. So in some ways, our society is very cynical. There's a play by Samuel Beckett called Waiting for Godot. And in that, Beckett says to his friend, "It's a beautiful day." And his friend says, "Yes, it makes you glad to be alive." And Beckett says, "Oh, no, I wouldn't go that far. It's a bitch of an earth." I would hate to have that as the last word. And I think there are some other lovely words that make the point more clearly. And they come from the book of Revelation. And it says very simply there, to him who loved us. So you have value. You are loved. You are loved by your maker. You are loved by your creator. Nothing you can do can change that love. And saved us from our sins through his blood. Your relationships have been put right. And made us to be a kingdom, priests to his Father and God. You have been given purpose in life. to me, that is good science and good theology. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, John. Thank you ever so much for that and for the presentation that worked. We're really grateful for that. Can I repeat to everybody that we have the opportunity now for a question and answer session? Do type your questions into the Q&A box that you'll see on the screen. I will then relay those verbally to John, who can then provide us with deep answers to them. So I will wait for a few moments while questions come in. Maybe I can kick off while I'm waiting for somebody else. You closed by talking about meanings that allow us to cope with that sort of adversities, and the COVID crisis is an example of that. What would you say to those who say that we're actually inventing meanings just to keep ourselves satisfied, to put some sort of calming influence on ourselves without actually the meanings really being real, that they're themselves artifacts that we've constructed?
I think that you and I, nobody has an option about meanings. We search for them. Whether we create them or not is another matter, but we will never stop searching for them. The cynic might give up, but it's never a happy giving up. The question is not whether they're real or not, but which are most satisfying, which work, which are most predictive. And I don't mean predictive necessarily in the sense that it can tell me what time the shops are going to open in the middle of a COVID crisis. It actually tells me I'm happy. I'm doing something worthwhile. I'm not trivial. I'm important. And now that doesn't mean self-important, but I'm significant. I don't think human beings can live without those. And it's not a matter of making them up. It's a matter of finding the one which works best.
Thank you. You're saying about the one that works best leads me to a question that's on the line there, which is, with this theology, how would you make sense of other theologies or philosophies, and they specify sort of Buddhism or Islam, and how they try to make sense of things?
The difficulty in answering this question is I've got absolutely no desire to caricature or misrepresent anything. I don't think that serves any useful purpose whatsoever. But I think Buddhism is an interesting one. My view as really an observer rather than a practitioner is it's an expression of what you might describe as Stoic philosophy. In Stoic philosophy, you have a closed system. Suffering is a factor, an unavoidable feature of the world. So what you must do is learn to cope with suffering. To me, that is, I find that intrinsically unsatisfying. What I want to do is to change the world, not to understand the world as it is. I'm not satisfied with the world as it is. I think there is something better, something we can create and make better. And so I'm to be honest, I'm unimpressed with a Stoical perspective. I think Islam is different in that it is theistic, but where I would go there is what I really love about my Christian faith is that I am loved. And I know that I am loved. There is something in me which says that I am loved. It's not that I'm just obedient. It's not that I just follow the rules. Actually, there is a relationship of father to son, and I use the term son generically. And so, to me, that is quite distinctive, and I value it immensely.
Thank you. There's a few other questions coming in. There's one here that says, how do you reconcile the cosmological predictions of the future of the Earth becoming burnt when the sun becomes a red giant, and the biblical promise of the renewal of the Earth?
Well, apart from that, there's a long time to go. If you go back to my cartoons, the issue is that the promise is that this will happen somehow. Now, that's not a get out, actually. It might sound like that, but if you go back to the idea of Messiah coming, again, no one would have anticipated how that would happen. A full incarnation, even though you can think of it in terms of, well, God always liked being with his people. You have the tabernacle, you have the temple, you have the Shekinah, you have God visiting Abraham, the burning bush. It's not that God is averse to visiting his people. In fact, that's what he loves to do. But who would have guessed he would come in the form of a human being? Now, I have the same anticipation for what I would describe as the new heaven and the new earth. Who would have guessed? Who could possibly guess what it's going to be like? So I'm quite happy to wait and find out, in all honesty.
Thank you. This is a more maybe a more philosophical question. You said about the mechanistic or inductive hypothesis, in that you said we assume it in science and it works. Do you think that theism provides more justification for the acceptance of inductive methods than atheism or naturalism?
No, I don't think so. I think inductivism is purely pragmatic. It really doesn't matter where it comes from, but it works. What it doesn't do, of course, is provide you with the value structure which helps you prioritize and decide about your life's decisions.
Thank you. It's quite a long question. I'll try and paraphrase some of this to you. You said that all sciences have a moral direction and it should be life affirming. What does life affirming? That could mean different things to different people. In terms of, how our response might be to genetic modification, human enhancement, etc. So how do we cope with the fact that life affirming means different things to different people?
To be honest, I think this is a really, really hard question, and one is never going to really understand it in the first moment of asking it. Part of the reason for choosing that expression this morning is been to get people to think of what does it mean to affirm life, and I completely accept that there will be different answers. And I am very happy to accept that my own understanding is not as profound as it ought to be. But it is a legitimate starting point from which most people can work. So I admit it, hold my hand up. I'm not very good at this. But actually, it's something that I think we can all agree and work on together.
Thank you. A question that relates back to something you mentioned at the beginning. You spoke about the cosmic fall. You indicate you don't see it's consistent with both science and scripture. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
So what I think I find difficult is when Christian belief, which you can see where it comes from originally, back from the Greek classics or medieval thought or Reformation thought, and in one way you can think, well, okay, that's fine. You can understand where people are coming from, etc., etc. But when those thoughts are held onto in the face of broader evidence base, I think, why? It just does not help. So if you have a situation where there is an interpretation of Genesis 1-3, where effectively the nature is considered to be a lost cause which is now being redeemed, and there's this great effort to redeem it throughout scripture. I think, well, I just do not see how that helps anyone in any way whatsoever. What is helpful, by contrast, is to understand that there is a project ongoing in which we can partake. This project of ongoing complexity and order, and we have the privilege of being actors in this drama. So I find that far more satisfying than, oops, it's all messed up. What are we going to do now?
Lovely, thank you. Here's one. What is the difference between Beckett's Bitch of an Earth and the words of Paul of, from this present evil age. And how do you ensure that the Christian focus on human goodness is not a flight of fancy into mysticism?
I think that's great. I really do. So a text without a context is a pretext. And I think you need to really think of Paul's writings in terms of the hope that is set before us. I think that Paul talks about running the good race, being faithful to the end, receiving the reward. And that is the context of the biblical narrative. That actually we are in a process of engaging for good. And it's tough at times. It's absolutely tough at times. Let's not make any mistake about that. But Paul's understanding is in a much broader context than that. And what was the second part?
How do you ensure the Christian focus on goodness isn't a flight of fancy into mysticism?
Well, that's why I come down to the affirmation of life. And it's why I start with the Trinity. We are talking about life and relationships, life being expressed through relationships. And this isn't mysticism. This is how I get on with my wife. This is how I love my neighbor. This is how I relate, how I engage. And I engage genuinely and authentically with God in my prayers. So that's not mysticism. That really is something which works out in daily life.
Lovely, thank you. This relates back to, I think, a question we may have had before, but puts it a little bit more strongly. Some scientists might say that religion is the answer to the human mind trying to comprehend mystery as the unknown, and that modern science, having dispelled myths and mysteries, has progressively made religion redundant. Has science really dispelled the unknown, or just merely redefined it?
I find science really helpful in redefining our understanding, and I really accept that. But you only go from one, and this is why I choose the term reducing uncertainty. It's a very careful choice because uncertainty comes in very many different forms. So yes, there are some things which science has shown are very unlikely to have happened, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. But as soon as you do that, you can never remove the need for a value structure, and it is the value structure which is critical here, not the mechanism. You can think of, frankly, mysticism is just another form of causal nexus, and I think that's why I use the term magic and astrology as examples of different ways of thinking. So let's not confuse the causal nexus with the value structure. And it's to avoid that confusion is why I've used observation, superstition, and then mysticism as a value structure, not as the causal nexus.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question that probably is unanswerable, but it's worth asking anyway. And that is, what type of anomaly in the data would make you change your theology?
I think that depends what the theology was. So I picked an example where I thought, well, I'm sure I will upset some people, but not intentionally. But it's a fair question. So if there was let me think of another one. Okay, at this point I may get into trouble, but you asked the question, so I'll have to be honest with you. There's another theological view that has been interpreted as total depravity. And that's again a consequence of the fall. I think, what does this mean? And I look around at my colleagues, at my non-Christian colleagues, and I just think some of them are really nice guys. In fact, most of them are really nice guys. What they really want answers to the questions of the meaning and the value of life. And they spend their lives in science doing that. And I admire them enormously for that. I just think it's a misconfiguration of the problem.
Thank you. You've said in your talk that happiness is, the question is happiness essential to your worldview? In living a happy life, but many would say that Christianity doesn't promise happiness just now, but a way of coping with suffering. Where does happiness fit in within this worldview?
Well, there's a good one. The problem with answering this question is that the answer can seem trivial, and I really don't want to do that. We're in lockdown. It's not hard. The inequalities of our society have been laid bare, and suffering around the world is terrible. But on the other hand, people are valuable. And that is the whole point. The person who is in difficulty, who is suffering, is valuable. And I think that God's answer is that, and this is what I found in my experience. And, I've had tough times. So a year ago, I was diagnosed with bowel cancer very rapidly. They operated, and then there was the chemotherapy afterwards. And during that, I was knocked off my bike. Honestly, it was tough. It was really hard. And it just changed your perspective on life. But God was with me. And what can I describe? But he was with me. He was with me in the ambulance after the bike accident. He was with me in the hospital. He was with me through the chemotherapy, and that made it much easier to cope, to see light at the end of the tunnel, to know that there was more to life than my current circumstances. And I would just have found life so much more difficult if that hadn't been the case.
Thank you. Thank you for that very personal answer to that question. Here's a question maybe relates back to your work, particularly with dementia. Can you give some examples of how this view interacts with your work on dementia, where maybe people's perception of reality is rather diminished or even incorrect? Can you give some examples of how that interacts with that?
So my job is mostly running a research team. So the Dementias platform has projects all over the country, and I engage with a variety of scientists. And the immediate way in which it reacts is that I value them as people. I don't see them as project fodder. I don't see them as projects to be micromanaged just so that I can look good in front of my funders. These are valuable people who deserve respect in their own right and encouragement with the difficulties they've faced. When it comes to people with cognitive impairment, with dementia, I go back to the last slide. These are valuable people, and I think they should be treated with every help and respect. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that what goes first are the recent memories. Often, the distant past memories are retained, and it's amazing how many come back with a faith and a trust of something bigger than their current circumstance, and I find that very encouraging.